Welcome to this show of the episode of the world according to Irina Tsukerman, our very special series on global politics on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman, a US based national security and human rights lawyer, as well as renowned geopolitical analyst. Her writings and commentaries have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. Every fortnight in the world, according to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina.
Thank you, and I'm glad to be here as always.
Several big topics again today, Irina, and we'll be coming to that. But first, let me understand this Malawi vice president. He dies in a plane crash. A lot of plane crashes happening nowadays. Iran lost its president just very recently. Wagner Group, its chief, it died. And again in a plane crash. Again, it was called an accident or whatever it is, and that's why I guess if I understand, the North Korean Supreme Leader Kim Jong, he travels by train mostly. If I understand, what do you make of all these crashes that has recently cropped up?
Well, with Iran, it's funny because even their military intelligence said it was an accident. Perhaps it's an embarrassing turn of events for Iran because it indicates a poor planning on their part. On the other hand, had they claimed that it was an international conspiracy, they would have had to engage in an act of war because an assassination of a president is an act of war, without a doubt. So they were stuck after a lot of heated rhetoric and accusations. It was a huge embarrassment, regardless. But the basic reality with a lot of these countries is that they use old planes and helicopters that are prone to crashes, and unfortunately a lot of the times these accidents happen. That's also true that there is a lot of corruptions in countries like Malawi. It's entirely possible that corruption can be exploited by third parties, including domestic opposition. The political climate there is highly polarized, but it is also true that there is just simply a lot of um, incompetence in managing aging equipment, and poor judgment, as in the case of Iran, which put all of its officials on one airplane and flew them in exceedingly bad, foggy weather, knowing that helicopters have a tendency to crash, especially if there's objects like mountains that are hidden from view. So a lot of the times it's just basically extremely poor judgment by um, corrupt governments and regimes that are they tend to blame their problems on everyone else except for their unwillingness to maintain the equipment better.
Right, Irina. All I can understand is this world leaders should certainly upgrade their place that they are traveling in, especially if it calls because the fate of their countries depend a lot on their decisions on themselves, and it is very important. Rest for their citizens also, I guess. A lot of companies are working towards this, towards better air safety. Be that as it may, let's come to our top stories. One of the top stories is about India election analysis. How do you see? We have got the elections now, results now, and Prime Minister Modi is back in power, but maybe not as strongly as it is because it's much more of a coalition. He has to be dependent on the coalition partners here. How do you see this election from that part of the world you are in, Irina?
So interestingly enough, there's been the Western coverage, both in the United States and in Europe, has been largely focused on whether or not, the government was undemocratic, and everyone's conclusion ultimately was because there was so much political loss. Oh, that shows that actually it was not undemocratic after all. I tend to look at the story a little bit differently. First of all, I think to some extent the fact that India has a coalition based system is a measure of its success, not a zero sum game between two different parties. Essentially, um, Prime Minister Modi's party came in the wake of he came to power in the wake of a major security situation in India. As we now know, it has since improved significantly. Tough measures were taken to address the security situation as well as the economic situation in other countries. And as the situation improves, some of the very things that brought the party to power are becoming in a way obsolete. Not because the power has nothing more to offer. I'm sure we will see more great things coming through, and we are seeing many great achievements every day. But domestically, when a situation is stable, people tend to look at their own needs and evaluate them differently. They no longer feel the pressing need of an emergency or an urgent situation, and they tend to look for more diverse option to balance out different priorities and interests inside the country. It's perfectly normal. It's a sign of a functional society, not a dysfunctional society, and it's not a sign of somebody doing something wrong and being punished for it by an uprising from the voters. It's a sign that people are just balancing out the different needs and interests that they want to see represented in their government. It's a huge country with a huge population, and I think it's a very positive sign. It's a good going in that direction, and the country is not in a constant state of emergency. Um, so that's how I tend to look at it. The other issue is that I find it very interesting that people tend to evaluate people outside India tend to evaluate its dynamics based on the patterns we see in the West. For instance, the issue of election interference in the West is evaluated on the basis of interference with the regional dynamics, ballots, and things like that, which in India would have been much harder due to the pluralism and due to the many different languages and different subcultures in its various regions. On the other hand, people tend to forget that there are other ways of impacting elections other than through direct influence on the public. For instance, you could have foreign powers providing the opposition with extra donations, foreign funding, extra help, amplifying their messaging to the public, intervening with the media in various ways, and providing them with free publicity or simply distorting the messaging from the other side. I am not saying that that is not necessarily what happened, but I wouldn't be surprised if several countries had an interest in doing everything possible to diffuse the influence on Prime Minister Modi and his party, specifically due to the nature of their successes both in economy and financial arena. Who would those parties be? One may wonder. There are four candidates that I can think of the top of the head. The first one, and not all of them necessarily would be. It's not an issue of choice. They could, in theory, be working in coalition to essentially misrepresent the political situation in India to the outside world. That's also election interference, even if they are not directly controlling anyone's voting patterns. That would be China, of course, which sees India as a rising power and a major economic rival. It would be Pakistan, which may not have the same means to do what China has the means to do in terms of financial infusions, but it knows India very well. It has access to the languages, and it could provide the sort of know-how to the different parts of the country that regional outsiders, would not necessarily have, and which would complicate any election impact for them. Third would be surprisingly for many Russia, not because Russia wants India to fail. On the contrary, they are counting on it as a major trade partner and want to strengthen their relations rather than weaken them. But because they specifically have an issue with Prime Minister Modi's party. They have an issue with the nationalist party in power, and I'm using the word nationalist in the best possible way here, because they're concerned that the more India turns towards its own interest, the less it becomes dependent on any other countries, including Russia, which for Russia with its financial situations is a major problem. It's a major obstacle. They want to see a coalition based group on opposition party because they are historically closer to dependency on the Soviet Union and on other countries in general, because they would not necessarily pursue the same emphasis on independent defense and other issues, and would be also easier to work with and manipulate. Finally, there is a fourth interested party, which is not necessarily one country. It's more over an ideological base of a combination of extreme leftist Islamist interest in any powers willing to in assorted mercenaries from Western and non-Western countries that have their own stakes in particular outcomes due to financial interests and so forth. So that coalition of non-state actors working in part for their own benefit and also for the benefit of potentially other powers in the background, they could be yet another factor that in various ways has tried to impact the view of this election, if not the election itself abroad. Whether or not they have the power to actually interfere isn't clear, but I do find it surprising that the polls have not reflected the changes in the political in the political landscape, because usually if people are very much concerned about any particular problem, they usually speak about it in the polls, and the world seems to have been surprised by the outcome. On the other hand, there has been a concerted effort to make certain issues quite polarizing at the poll, whether or not the public really perceives them as legitimate concerns. If they're played up enough, even if they're not an actual issue, they can be perceived as such, uh, um, especially as we have said, it's a very large country and different parts of communications between them are not always aligned. It's just the reality of having a very big population. So issues such as divisions over religion in particular have been played up recently, particularly in Western and other ideologically aligned media. That doesn't mean that there is an actually such a huge crisis in India, it just means that it may be perceived as much bigger crisis than it actually is, which could also impact the elections and the outcomes indirectly for people who are particularly concerned about it, regardless of the actual reality. So those are just some ways of looking at the situation that I don't really see being analyzed quite as much in the Western media. They have all taken a very, very zero sum look. Oh well, it's a democracy because Modi lost, but not. But what? But they're not really speaking to what has may have contributed to those losses. What are the reasons for it?
Right, well explained all these things, and perspectives can be, you see, Western perspectives can be their own way. Indian people have given their will that who they want to govern in what they have balanced it out in their own manner. India has seen coalition governments for many years earlier on, and they have also worked in their own manner. In fact, this time the people of India have spoken. uh, Prime Minister Modi has gained at several places it's been the coalition partners. But one thing has come out in terms of democracy is that uh, people have spoken. Secondly, more than 600 parties, small parties, independents, and all, they contested in the election all across the country. There are main parties, Congress, BJP, and other parties are there, but people do not know much about it. But if I understand, more than 600, 700 smaller parties participated in elections. Whether they lost is a different thing, but at least they were able to fight. This is the greatness of a democratic system, and especially for the largest democracy in the world. People can look like in the US. You have got many. You have got the two-party system. They've got more parties there, but these number of parties, if they are participating or able to participate, independents are getting elected very nicely. Then that shows the democratic system that is working well, and this can be an example for others. There rest problems can be everywhere, and there will be people who or candidates will be much more stronger. It is much more personality based. But I guess democracy balances it out, and this time people have balanced it out in their own manner. But do you think, in terms of reforms, do you think it will get impacted in any manner? Earlier on also, even if the reforms the earlier government was trying to do, even with the strong majority, it got them back. It did not go further, like the land acquisition bill, like the farmers reforms and all. So people were protesting. So it listened to the to the people and all. But with a coalition government, maybe the reforms which were required, every political party is very smart enough to understand what is required, what is not required, and they may work better for economic reforms in that way. If we look at it, what is your understanding if the West fears that reforms may get stalled in any manner because of a coalition government?
Well, here's the thing about the West. Ironically, they were not really focused that much on the reforms per se. Rather, they were basically focused on the Cliff's Notes version of the reports. The reports, the information provided in the media, which not always accurately reflected the full substance of the reports. I don't think anyone actually read the text of any of those bills. I'll be honest with you. I think the overwhelming majority of people commenting about this issue have never looked at anything that the bills actually say. So I think that regardless of what actually happens, the comments are going to be along ideological lines, and not necessarily along the lines of close structural examination of the text, its meaning, and how it could actually be implemented within India's specific system. Without that examination, I think it's very hard to render an expert opinion on many issues that have a distinct particularity and not just a very general political sense that people ascribe to it. Uh, I do think that we can assess the general sense of satisfaction by different sectors of the country. I think it's a mistake to play up some at the expense of others. And I think there were many voices across India that never get a hearing. In the West, I think there is small voices that get disproportional amount of weight in terms of media coverage. I would be shocked if any of the media go around small villages interviewing people about domestic issues and the impact of them. We generally hear a few very well known individuals complaining loudly about things that are, hardly have everyday impact on most people. So I'm I'd be astounded if the direction of the reform had gotten any thorough understanding or hearing in the court of public opinion outside the country. That said, um, the Indian media and analysts do have a responsibility if they want to get a better coverage of and understanding of these events, to also be more systematic in presenting the case for these reforms to the outside world just as much as they're doing inside the country, not because they need anyone's approval, but if they want people to understand what's actually going on. It's a complicated system, and most people barely understand what's going on in their own countries, much less much else um, somewhere else. I do think that coalition governments require a lot of compromise. Generally speaking, it's not always easy compromise, and of course, it makes it difficult to push through any particular agenda at all. But does that mean that nothing can get done? I also don't think that's true. I think there is a very clear mandate despite these losses, and as you yourself said, those losses are not necessarily because one other party made such a huge gain. It's because of the proliferation of many smaller actors with quite possibly very specific agendas for very small issues. And if that is the case, that may not necessarily derail the overall agenda. It may just shift focus to smaller issues that are not necessarily pushed by the larger governing parties.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that is where the power of the democracy is. That if bigger parties are not taking issues, then people force them to look at their issues, or they have that capacity to fight for their issues and push for those issues to be taken care of. Be that as it may, as I said, the Indian public has spoken, and the will of the people will be spoken through the Parliament of India, and that's the way it is. But in no way I don't see it is going to be any sort of stopping with what is good for the Indian public. The Indian public is smart enough to talk to its lawmakers, and the lawmakers are also smart enough to understand what the people of the country want, because it's elections, and elections are held every 5 years or earlier if there is any issue. Be that as it may, let's move on to the other issues that we need to talk today. We're talking about the IDF. IDF gets blacklisted by the UN, and it's almost like standing alongside Al Qaeda if we look at it from that point of what's happening. Slovakia has recognizes Palestine. Spain joins ICJ lawsuit. Brazil withdraws ambassador. Israel getting isolated in the world bit by bit?
So, if you look at it from a day to day perspective, none of these issues are specifically dispositive, and none of them have really seriously affected what's actually going on. Israel has successfully rescued 4 hostages. There is a US resolution which is probably not going anywhere in practical terms but has generated a lot of attention. So, these steps, you could see that separately and distinctly. They're political steps, the steps pushed very hard by particular interests at the expense of other interests. Israel may not have the capacity to devote full diplomatic attention to arguing with with the United Nations, and Slovakia is not necessarily its primary target audience at the moment. US is the Arab world, is maybe the European Union and UK, and but Slovakia on its own is probably does not have as much sway. But if you put these things together, they do represent a disturbing pattern. And the fact is, overall, Israel is failing in its communication strategy to meet these political needs, which are in some ways important to its military effort as well. Not because they're affecting anything in the field, but because they're creating a very demoralizing and difficult political environment. They can have an impact, an economic impact on Israel, and they can certainly make things difficult for the IDF outside the country in the many political and diplomatic realms and even fundraising efforts. Yeah, and those issues should be taken to consideration. So yes, Israel is going to do what it needs to do, regardless of what anyone sees it and does. But it's certainly no need to make things more difficult than they are, and it is concerning that though the detractors of Israel can take a look at this larger picture, first of all, see the general trends, which decidedly painting out Israel to be a human rights violator and an aggressor, and use it to gain an even bigger political advantage outside Israel in the court of public opinion, and to discredit it in various ways, and to put limits on trade and on engagement, which is already happening. Second, if people see that Israel doesn't care about its own image, it makes it difficult to respond and to defend Israel. If Israel is not taking care to defend its own interest, it's why should people uh, um, go to the trouble to do so on its behalf? So that's not a very good message to be sending out at this time. But it's also a potential sign that is positive for Israel, in the sense of the fact that people are trying so hard to discredit and undercut it means that Hamas has something to fear. It understands that Israel now is in a militarily winning position, having cut off access to tunnels, taking control of, made major gains in Rafah, where um, Hamas military commanders are situated, and essentially cutting them off from the stream of weapons and other resources flowing into the country, and making it much more difficult for them to be able to maintain their operations. So, of course, they would intensify political pressure on Israel at this time, and and to try to demoralize it and to isolate it as much as possible to prevent them from finishing off these military operations and making and collapsing the entire infrastructure. So we should keep that in mind as well. It's actually in some ways a sign that Israel is making major gains on the military front where it counts.
Right, right, Irina. Now let's move on to the other issue about Biden-Zelensky meeting. What has Biden said? Okay, we are sorry, we could not provide you aid earlier on. And what does it mean now? Where does this Russia-Ukraine war move on there? Tell us a bit about this meeting. What can we expect in terms of any peace efforts for the Russia-Ukraine war?
So there is an upcoming major NATO meeting, which is expected to discuss this process. So far, it has met with some setbacks. For instance, the European Union and European members of NATO from the European Union, they were trying to pass an $100 billion financial aid package, which has had to be rolled back in part due to an ongoing pushback, and in part we are seeing that many Russia-backed parties are coming to power in the European Parliament. European Parliament is not necessarily the most powerful institution in the EU, but it can too have a political impact in terms of expressing public opinion. Um, so we're dealing with political setbacks. We're also dealing with the reality that Biden is not necessarily fighting Putin right now. He's fighting Donald Trump. And so his efforts are to balance the perception of continuing to support Ukraine with trying to appeal to people who are not necessarily in favor of US position on this matter. Uh, Combined with the fact that Biden was always overly cautious on providing Ukraine with the type of aid that could help them finish off Russia quickly, combined it with the fact that over 2 years have been largely wasted, and there's been mistakes made, and there's now a more difficult in recruitment. Russia has repopulated its front lines with a new set of recruits and has overcome some of the sanctions and gained access to the some of the equipment it needs. We are facing a much more difficult situation than earlier on. The best thing Biden could do right now is not apologize for past failures, which, by the way, he had the power to circumvent through legal measures as the chief executive, but to focus on expediting as much assistance as quickly as possible, and also removing his own imposed limitations on effective warfare, such as limiting to the types of strikes Ukraine is able to do with long-range missiles. So I think in that sense, while his support is appreciated as always, I think he could be far more effective if he stuck to action rather than words.
Right, right, Irina. So let's look at the world now, is it? And especially in the context of Africa, U.S. military is doing exercises in Africa, and in Africa you have this new dynamics of Russia getting a much more stronghold there. China is already there. Now, how should we look at it? Is it another sort of a Cold War which is coming up, and US is not the only power that is there in the world? People, other countries have much more options today to align with, and then you have got that is where the US military exercises have come in. I want to understand that for the public. Also, you see Japan, South Korea, even India has got that soft power in Africa. So how do you do this? Even in the Middle East, how do you, it's a new world order that is getting political world order that is getting created. US is losing its charisma if we look at it from that point of view. Russian foreign minister, he has just concluded his Africa tour. How do you look at it in this overall aspect?
Well, Russia is certainly looking to maximize every advantage it has. It has no choice, really. The sanctions in the have been effective to some extent in the sense of hitting the particular technology sectors that it needs for the war effort. They have not been effective for various reasons in stopping the economic flow, primarily because they're not being fully and consistently enforced, and because it has gotten taken so much time to get all the parties on the same page, and frankly, half the world at least is not involved in those sanctions. We're talking primarily about NATO powers and a few other allies like Japan. So still, there's a lot of work to do to make those sanctions effective. But Russia understands that U.S. strategy in Africa and other global, so-called global South countries has been primarily focused on countering Russia and China, and that is not an effective way of promoting good relations with anyone if they're being just seen as being used as proxies. And I think the African nations have sent a very strong, if somewhat uh, misplaced message in terms of the openness to to the Russian rapprochement with them. Moreover, experts in the US have criticized the US strategy in Africa and other places. There's been a lot of show and not a lot of and not a lot of enforcement. US has pledged large sums of money for things like climate change. We could argue about the whether that was the right priority, but it has reportedly not come through with many of its pledges. It has tried to be more consistent in pursuing deals with various countries like Angola, Zambia, and so forth. But it's started late in the game after other countries have already made a lot of groundwork, and so far we're still seeing very largely um, um, big government projects, not a lot of talk about the major humanitarian effort that the US has consistently contributed to Africa. And that's part of the problem, that Russia has played up any minor achievement they've made, and China has been going on about its infrastructural projects, which, by the way, are ending badly for the African countries. But US has not been particularly good at amplifying the successes that it has made. On the other hand, we have the rise of middle powers which are taking advantage of the chaotic and environment and vacuum of power, with the US not being really present all that much in Africa, comparatively speaking, for their own interests, which include access to natural resources in Africa, but also soft power, and trying to essentially gain political foothold, or to gain public opinion, depending on the country. And Turkey has been involved in Africa for a very long time with humanitarian effort that has served its interests well, in addition to its military prowess. Iran is largely focused on recruitment of followers and expanding the sheer reach, but also in selling sophisticated weapons to governments. UAE, Saudi Arabia have been in competition with each other and with Qatar over military bases, over resources, over political support for various governments. But Saudi Arabia has not been all that present, other than as a diplomatic mediator lately. It's been other Gulf countries focusing on both soft and hard power. And of course, we have Japan and South Korea, and of course, Brazil, all playing their own role in different ways, and India as well, expanding its reach. But those efforts have been comparatively slow and limited compared to what China and Russia have been doing, each in their own way. However, expect to see more of it. India is generally expanding its soft power reach around the world, and Japan and South Korea are much more intent on countering Chinese influence, especially. So we will probably see more in the years to come.
Right, right. And let's look at the trilateral summit between Japan, South Korea, and China. What is this all about? What should we understand? Means that, does this mean that Taiwan will lose its backing, because here the dynamics are totally different?
Well, Japan, South Korea, and China have been trying to resolve some of the differences to de escalate the worst of their ages on some of the issues. But as we have seen from similar efforts between US and China, it's a very long and hard road. And China has not been playing in good faith, and I think Japan and South Korea are fully aware um, over the fact that China's ideological leanings and ambitions are not going anywhere. So I think what they're trying to do is simply a tactical de-escalation to avoid very direct confrontations and to make the best of possible economic engagement, which, by the way, has been ongoing between all three countries this entire time. Interestingly enough, somehow the international community has managed to, in many cases, diverge the economic trade from political conflicts. But we are even seeing Russian gas still flowing through Ukraine, even despite brutal clashes between the two countries. Um, so we are seeing this tendency, but how far it's actually going to work with China, it's also hard to say, because of course it also likes to take advantage of countries in weaker positions. And Japan and South Korea, on the other hand, have been realigning closer and closer to the Western goals against China. A lot depends on what the West ends up doing. If Japan and South Korea sense that Europe and US are getting more serious about countering China, they're less likely to try to find their own way out of the situation.
Right, right. So we talked about some big nations here, and let's talk about one small nation, Sudan, and more massacres in Darfur. What does it mean? We have forgotten Sudan altogether. Is there respite for them in any way?
Well, I have news that there is going to be an upcoming UN resolution considering some of these, therefore, massacres. But in terms of media coverage, certainly it has been not even a fraction of what the Gaza conflict, or for that matter, Ukraine, have received. Um, the reason being, Sudan does not directly impact global trade avenues, unlike the other two conflicts, which have generated a whole host of side issues. Second, quite frankly, there is a lack of expertise on that front. And third, it's an issue. Sudan is a civil war between two warlords, two generals, each of whom is entrenched in a power struggle at the expense of their populations. So this is not nearly as a compelling a story to Western audiences. The sectarian, tribal uh, warfare with the religious elements and ideological elements and elements of various parties switching sides at different points in conflict, it's complex, it's difficult, it's not as compelling as David versus Goliath story. So basically, two different powers fighting um, for whatever reason. And the too many external powers involved in ways that are questionable morally and legally. That to make sense of it in a very simple presentation for audiences that don't follow African events very closely to begin with. So those three elements have contributed to this profound lack of understanding and a lack of interest in the matter. And we're not seeing the protest that once rocked college campuses about Darfur, admittedly very briefly in the in a very superficial way, with few people really understanding where Darfur was or why there were massacres to begin with. Now we're not seeing even that much. The entire focus of college concern has been entirely about Gaza. um so that's another element, having these Western movements built up for the benefit of one particular interest, to the complete exclusion of all other things going on, including the world's deadliest humanitarian crisis at this point, which is happening as a result of this war.
Right, right. Hope the world wakes up to it, at least as a humanitarian crisis, and this gets over soon. As you said, UN is looking into the matter. I guess it is time to have a new body altogether. UN does not seem to have actually played the role it has supposed to, the way we had thought. I guess it is time to look at things. People are already talking about it. The world is changing, and I guess the UN also has to change. One or two resolutions here and there do not make much difference to the world. I guess that those are my personal views. I don't know what's your view on this, Irina.
Well, we've been hearing that for a long time. When I was in college many years ago, there was the same discussion taking place, and I'm sure even before I was quite as politically aware. I'm sure there was the same criticism. I don't think UN as a body is going away fully anywhere. When you have that much investment by so many actors, it's difficult to get rid of it completely. I just think there is going to be an effort for regional and issue-based alliances, and we are already seeing a
Absolutely.
lot of it going on a lot of the world, and it can be quite effective when done right. In fact, Russia and China have made a lot of political and economic gains specifically by masterminding such alliances. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is one example. The Eurasian Economic Union is another avenue. BRICS is not effective on many issues, but it is effective on circumventing sanctions and promoting trade among its members. It's not effective on political front because of distrust and conflicting interests among its members. It's not going to be a defense alliance, nor is it meant to be. But on some issues, it has an impact which should not be ignored. So we are seeing a lot of these groups, and of course, on the U.S. has also tried to mastermind its own version, the Quad, the I2U2, the Abraham Accords, and so forth. Um, I think we'll see more of that in the future. How it's going to play out, given the current polarized climate and increasing fracturing of interests over various conflicting interests in various conflicts, remains to be seen. But I think such alliances are much easier to manage and can be more effective than trying to get hundreds of countries with completely different systems and outlooks on the same to support the same issues.
Absolutely. I too think about the importance of regional alliances. And if you look at it from a US perspective, even the currency point of view, US has its dollar, EU has its euro, and there is BRICS. They are talking about a BRICS currency. There is a lot of talk going on, but I don't see much movement. Have you heard
No,
anything
no.
about this BRICS currency thing? It might bring a lot of respite to a lot of people if you look at it, because when you exchange dollars, you have to spend a lot of money, Irina, from an Indian perspective, if you look at it.
I don't think it's going to happen. Not only is the BRICS currency not going anywhere due to the extreme economic differences between even the main members of the alliance, much less all the new observer and other states that have recently joined, but many countries are dropping the yuan, which they have adopted recently for political reasons, and returning to the dollar, precisely due to the concerns about China's reliability on many issues. So I think the market, in that sense, speaks for itself. We can make all the political arguments in the world, but if people just don't put their trust in currency or in their own partners, there's nothing anyone else can do about it.
Right, right. Thanks for that perspective. Now let's look at that sort. With whatever regional alliances take place, the fact is, we just had this NATO Stratum conference in Riga, and it focuses on the role of AI in info war. So that's where the big thing. This is the last topic of the day. That's where the big focus is: information war. Even if you work in a regional way, it is going to be information war all everywhere. And that is the big thing in today's time. Every country is working towards this. What should we make of this conference? What was this all about? Where does AI come into this? What is information war? How should we look at it?
Well, I can tell you from direct experience of being there that there are some amazing tools entering the marketplace that can transform global interactions in ways that are simply unimaginable. That said, a lot will depend on who and how implements these tools, and I think down the road, all that will happen is that it will just make all sides in all conflicts much more distrustful of information out there, and will complicate the ability to discern uh, truth from propaganda a great deal more than it already has. In and it's going to make the information landscape both much more sophisticated, but also much more complicated, and for both practitioners of information warfare and end users. But on the other hand, I think the political discourse around these topics remains mired in stereotypes, theories, and disengagement from of the political and regulatory framework decision makers and practitioners, the tech designers, the people who are actually making this product. And I think in general there's still too much overcaution, too much reliance on on outdated frameworks. And one of the issues I've heard NATO repeat is that they don't view China as an adversary; they view it as as an obstacle or a threat, which is, two entirely different things. And if you can't really define who your enemy is, or figure out that a country has a completely polar opposite and irreconcilable outlook to yours, no amount of strategic communicating or theoretical framework design is going to counter the fact that you are not going to have an approach that can be effective in this climate. And we are seeing that. We are seeing Europe in particular, but also even the US, struggle and with consistency on how to deal with China. And decoupling, the economic decoupling is certainly a major struggle, but even politically, there is still not a clear direction. But for China, the direction, I think, is very clear. They will try to um, they will try to mitigate risks on certain fronts, because they obviously need economic partners and outlets, but they will do so to their own advantage and with a long-term goal in sight. I don't think Europe, the US, and others so far have clear goals on what they actually want to see happen with whether it's with China, Russia, Iran, or anyone else. They just have this general desire for bad things to stop, but that's not a strategy.
Absolutely, absolutely. The world is changing very fast, and a lot of things are will be changing with the artificial intelligence coming in, especially in the relations between company. Be that as it may, every fortnight we come across, come with you with your special episode every 2 weeks. The world according to Irina Tsukerman. We traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insight from Irina's perspective. Thank you for this bi-weekly episode perspective. We'll come back again in 2 weeks' time. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of The World According to Irina Tsukerman on the KAJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much again for joining us.
Thank you.